Okay, we're recording. I am Brandon Polite, professor of philosophy at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, and I'm joined by Emmie Malone, who's an associate professor of philosophy at Lone Star College in Houston, Texas. Emmie, thanks so much for joining me again.
Thanks for having me. Really excited to be here.
I am very excited to have you here. So we're talking about your paper, which you know I absolutely love, called Rhinestone Cowboys, The Problem of Country Music Costuming, which is presently, as of this recording, forthcoming from the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism. It's available online now, open access as editor's choice. So anyone who wants to read it can read it for free right now. And I highly encourage everyone to do so. So, Emmie, in the paper, you're giving us an account of basically fashion in country music as it relates to country music. You're doing a lot of awesome stuff in here. And so I guess just to start things off, can you just talk about the relationship between country music and fashion, or just country music costuming in general, and then we'll proceed from there.
Yeah. So there is a long history of country music costuming. I mean, whether or not it's costuming or just fashion, I guess would be a matter of opinion. But I was motivated in part because of two apparent paradoxes having to do with country music costuming, both of which had to do with what's come to be known as the Nudie Suit. So it's named after a tailor, Nudie Cone. And there's two versions of the paradox. One's, I can show you actually some of these for reference. I don't know if you
Yeah.
can do that. All right. So you should be seeing now a few of these. It's kind of become a brand name word association, like Kleenex as facial tissue or something like that. But these happen to all be designed by Nudie Cone. And you probably have seen suits like these with fringe, bright neon colors, elaborate embroidered, colorful patterns, rhinestones in some cases. And okay, so the first of these paradoxes is brought up by oh my god, his name brought up on Cocaine and Rhinestones, the country music history podcast, where the claim is made that there can't be anything called authenticity in country music, because if people were making authentic country music, why would they be wearing something like this? If country music is really about rural working class people from the South, or Scotch-Irish settlers to the South, you wouldn't see someone, a sharecropper, we're told, wearing something like this. So it can't really be authentic. The other paradox, the second one, is trying to reconcile country music's kind of standard image of the male country singer as, hyper masculine, rugged, individualistic cowboy with these effeminate looking suits, right? So I try to take both those on at the same time in the paper.
Awesome, right? And so how does the nudie suit, or something like the nudie suit, come into being, right? Why do country artists start wearing these clothes, right? Because, as you discuss in the paper, when country, sort of begins its life roughly as hillbilly music, right? The stage costume was like overalls and, workwear, right? Associating the artist with the place that, the music comes from. And then over time, it shifts to these really flamboyant, over the top, campy outfits. And so what's the history there? How do we get to the nudie suit?
Yeah, so pop music in general, that is not jazz or folk music, takes off with the emergence of recording technology. So right when recording technology emerges, you have this pop music category called old time music. And so a lot of this earliest country music was old time music. That's basically just folk music branded for the recording industry, right? Where you see the emergence of bands and artists, and that mattering that who the artist is in a way that it doesn't for folk music. And because they're playing old time music, they're just playing music that was traditional, and they, in their costumes, dress up in traditional clothing to look like they're doing it in the period appropriate time, right? The issue with this is that very quickly it becomes basically just music for old people, and they're wanting to try to pitch it to younger audiences. And so they do a kind of rebrand. And a lot of these bands, they actually just rebrand the exact same bands. It's not like a different wave of artists come in. So you have bands that were old time bands, like here I'm showing you Dr. Bate and his Augmented Orchestra, or sometimes called Dr. Bate and his Augmented String Band. And those bands will change their names to things like the Fruit Jar Drinkers or Gid Tanner and the Skillet Lickers. These are the kinds of hillbilly names, right? And Fruit Jar Drinkers, obviously, a reference to moonshine or, so the image that we associate with this, and this is all like laid out by the country music historian Richard Peterson in his book, Crafting Country Music or Creating Country Music. They adopt this persona of the hillbilly that we commonly associate with it, like drinking Mountain Dew, being in Deliverance, or whatever. And this works to kind of have like it starts to be a fun persona. Young people like it. It plays well. You have shows like Hee Haw, right? It's comedic. They get a kind of foothold in the industry, but people really don't respect hillbillies. I think I quote a passage from a Variety cover story on hillbilly music where they say something to the effect of, this is from 1923, I think. The hillbilly, they're explaining to their audience who the hillbillies are, and it says that illiterate genera of white trash from the mountains of North Carolina and Tennessee. They're mostly illiterate. They have the intelligence of morons. It goes on like that. And so it did open up the industry a lot for like rural Southern artists. But in the end, people really didn't think it was a good marketing decision long term because no one wanted to be the hillbilly, right? So what happens is at this point, hillbilly music eventually will become country music, and it becomes country music as part of country and Western music. So when they're dividing up the charts to kind of segment the market at this time period, they have pop music, which is music for upper and middle class white audiences. They have race music, which is music for black audiences. And then they have hillbilly music, which is music for working class or poor white audiences. And what they do is they combine that hillbilly music with the rise of Western films. So there's a lot of singing cowboy movies, and they just put those on the charts together as country, the hillbilly music, and Western, the music from Westerns. So the image that gets associated with country music, because it's sharing this charting, is that of singing cowboys, right? Gene Autry and Roy Rogers, who I'm showing you some here. But they're not just a cowboy, right? Cowboys, this is very elaborate for a cowboy. And part of the reason for that is they have all these really bright colors, these bright colors of the suits and stuff like that. That has a kind of functional role within the Western of setting the actor against a natural background, making them more visible. So if you're showing up on a desert all the time, you're really going to stand out wearing a blue shirt. Or wearing these highly elaborately embroidered shirts. So that becomes kind of the image. People like that the cowboy represents the open West, this idea of the rugged individual. It's a lot more expansive. It doesn't have any of the baggage of old time music or hillbilly music. And this is how we associate country music with the image of the cowboy. It actually comes in through Western, not from the countryside. These suits will just eventually get more and more garish as time goes on. You're already seeing some of that here. These were designed by Bernard Rodeo-Ben Lichtenstein for film, essentially. It isn't until Nudie Cone introduces rhinestones to the rhinestone cowboy suit that it reaches its like peak of gaudiness. So we already saw a few examples of that, but I'll take you back to some of these by Nudie Cone.
Yeah, right. And so, I mean, there's a lot going on here that's super interesting, right? One thing that you're pointing out is that country as we know it as a genre comes into being through the mashup of the rebranded hillbilly music, right, as country with Western music, which was music from Hollywood Westerns, right? These mythologized, cleaned up versions of the West, right? The Old West, meant to sort of showcase post-war values, basically, of individualism, et cetera, right? And the mashup of those two distinct things, right? Hillbilly music rebranded as country and Western music coming from Hollywood Westerns, right, is just a decision by record executives, right? It's, well, instead of creating a new genre category, let's just stick these two together. And now this is the music. And now, that's sort of the origin of country as we know it today.
Yeah, yeah, and I think this is what compels people to come in and say that, dude, where is the authenticity here? This was all done by record executives. It's not anything like what country people do, and I think in part this is tied to a particular idea about what authenticity would be in country music, and I think it's kind of on the model with authenticity in folk music. So if you want to play authentic, I don't know, folk music from Japan, you're going to either need to be Japanese or you're going to need to be doing it in the traditional way that Japanese people did play that music. And people had some success applying this kind of model to blues. There's a kind of sense that blues is a folk music of a particular group of people. And I think some people have the story, it probably originates in Bill Malone's book, Country Music USA, which is that country music is the folk music of the Scotch-Irish settlers to the American South who are living in, rural areas, they're working class. And so country music should be by and for them. And as a result, since they wouldn't be wearing this stuff, it's not authentic. That's the argument anyway.
Yeah, right. Which is weird in a sense, right? There's the expectation that any performer going on a stage is just going to wear their day-to-day clothes going on the stage and not dress things up, right? I mean, granted, dressing up versus wearing a nudie suit like this, those are distinct things. But these people, presumably when they go to church, they try to dress up. And so performing on a stage, you'd expect the same thing. And so it's a really peculiar attitude to have that, anyone wearing a nudie suit is somehow less authentic because of what they're wearing.
And I mean, I'd also say in a lot of folk music, the folk music is part of a ritual where people are going to be wearing particular garments that they wouldn't wear in their everyday life. So I'm just very skeptical of this kind of story in general, at least for costuming. I think it especially doesn't work in country music, and that's because we have the wrong idea of what authenticity is in country music.
Yeah, and I think related to this too is sort of the issue of class, right? That country music, starting off as old time, turning into hillbilly was, at least as the record executives carves things up, this is music for poor or working class white people, right? And so the sense of these nudie suits are presumably incredibly expensive, right, relative to ordinary clothes. And so you can imagine, I think on the story that Bill Malone, no relation to you, is giving, right, is you would think that fans of this type of music would be turned off by nudie suits, right? When in fact, that's not the case. They would be alienated by them, right? These are gaudy, these are showy, they're rubbing in their success, right? But that wasn't how the audience took up and responded to these things.
Yeah, exactly. And I think if we have the right idea of authenticity for country music, then not only can we explain why it's okay to do this, but why it actually lends you authenticity. And so, I mean, I have an account of that I think I talked about the last time I was on the show. But
yeah, do you want to briefly rehearse that or repeat it here?
Yeah. So, on my view, country music kind of operates like a dual character concept. There are different ways of cashing this out. One might just be that Genres in general tend to have a kind of agential identity or practical identity associated with them. So we're used to thinking of like punks and metalheads. People define their kind of practical identity in terms of the genre that they participate in. And these are the kinds of things that make sense of us talking in particular ways. So we wouldn't normally say, oh, this person is an electrician, but they're not a real electrician. That doesn't mean anything. But if I say, oh, this artist is punk, but they're not a real punk, or it's not real hip hop, or it's not real country music, people think that makes sense to say that it is country, but it's not real country. And the difference is that country music in this descriptive sense is just meeting certain sonic features, right? It qualifies according to the rules of the genre. But the real country music is the country music that embodies the values that we associate with this practical identity. And this is conceptually negotiated. So I know if you changed what it means to be into country music, if country music gets dominated by you and you dress a certain way, I'm going to be associated with that as a person who listens to country music. And so we have this stake in this shared identity, and we navigate that by engaging in a discourse of authenticity. And I think this can happen in actual attributions of authenticity, just saying that's real country music, but it happens in other ways too.
Yeah, right. And a lot of, what we might call pop country, right, is often just derided by some segment of country fandom as not real country, right? Because it has too many trappings of pop or rock or hip hop, right? And therefore it's no longer real country, where real country is, I don't know what, right? Whatever Willie Nelson did or Johnny Cash did or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, and you can do this for rap and all of those. And I think that's the question of what authenticity is, right? What does it mean to be an authentic country musician? On one account, it's to be a rural working class poor person from the American South. But on my account, it means having a certain set of values. And so if we keep that in mind and stop thinking about it in terms of like class or geography, I think you can make a lot more sense of like what's going on in the Nudie Suit. So I can get into a little bit, if you want, the history of the elements of the Nudie Suit and how they function.
Yeah, please go for it.
So we did already talk about like someone like Roy Rogers or Gene Autry, that the elaborate embroidery and the colors, those are trying to set the actor off against the background, a naturalistic background. You also see things like fringe here, or in less crazy costuming, like John Wayne and Hondo. This is like a classic Western wear look, the fringe. And the fringe, it comes from indigenous American practices of adding fringe to jackets. And there's two kind of thoughts about this. Probably it serves a dual function. One is that it can break up the human silhouette. So if you're trying to camouflage yourself and not be seen, you look less like a person standing out in a desert or an open field and more like a blob, right? The other idea is that if you get really wet, it'll wick water away from your body. So it has a kind of functional role, the fringe. You also have, in pearl snaps, a kind of functional role. So these, I'm showing you here on a bull rider. It's hard to see the pearl snaps, but these were developed by Rodeo Ben Lichtenstein, who was watching a bull riding event, and he saw the bull rider get a horn caught in his shirt, and he was gored and dragged around on account of that. And he was like, we need some kind of like fast release fasteners. And so he comes up with these just flat metal fast fasteners, which are still on some like Levi's shirts. And then eventually they become embellished and add the rhinestones to them. But they served a function, these metal fasteners. And then once you get to Nudie Cohn's background is, as his nickname suggests, his real name is Nucha Krylenko, but he goes by Nudie Cohn because he gets his start as a tailor making costumes for burlesque shows. And in burlesque shows, the idea is, especially at this time period that he was making them, to cover the bits that you want people to be looking at, the bits people are supposed to be looking at. in a burlesque show, cover them with rhinestones so that when the stage light hits them, it'll catch the eye. So people who are sitting further back can still make out the silhouette of it. So there's a kind of functional aspect to the rhinestones, but then also there's a kind of class element that you want people who are sitting in the cheap seats to be able to see. And so that's like a natural way in for country musicians, right? Who are concerned about their, I don't know, working class audiences.
Yeah, right. And so yeah, it's as you describe in the paper, they're doing it in part and perhaps in large part for the audience, right? That this is a sign of respect toward the audience that I'm dressing up and I'm, in the way that the Western actor is being set off from the background, right? And then when the spotlight hits, the rhinestones are going to twinkle and the people in the back are going to be able to like see the person, right? And so it's a sign of respect rather than, showing off, basically.
Yeah, and I do think this runs pretty deep. Like in the paper, I quote fans and designers and artists talking about this sense that they owe that to the audience. And I think that there's like a sense in which if this is really supposed to be music for working class people, the artist in some ways is signifying that their own continuity with those people. So working class people tend to wear uniforms. Their fashion is dictated by their profession, and country music costuming is dictated by one's profession. They'll say things like this, like, well, if they can get up and put on a suit and go to work, then I owe it to them to do the same, to give them that respect. And so I do think there's a bit of a class element in that, in addition to like the functional element. It's just that these are performing the function of this job, and what the sharecropper wears is performing a function of what that job is.
Yeah, right. And so, I mean, interesting though is like the particular nature of the country costumes, right? Of the nudie suits, like, coming from burlesque, right? Rhinestones for burlesque dancers, right? And the fact that the colors are, bright pinks and bright yellows and et cetera. There's, this interesting sort of gendered thing going on here that you also discuss in the paper. So talk a bit about that.
So the second paradox that I said is the agential identity, the one I've been trying to pick out. It's associated, at least in its masculine form, with masculinity, with utilitarianism, this kind of like rugged, no frills attitude of men. These suits don't do that, right? They cost $10,000. They have a lot of literal frills on them. They're not very masculine. And so what's going on here? So my answer to that is that there's a kind of common currency between low class aesthetics and queerness. And so this is something that Nadine Hubbs in her book, Rednecks, Queers, and Country Music talks about, that there's an association between poverty and crime and queerness and poverty, queerness and crime. They all kind of form this trifecta. And you do see this, right? So I'll mention a few. In the post-war period, this is the time when country music is coming into its own. Women's fashion is very masculine. The differences in fashion between men and women are very small because women during the war are doing jobs that men do. And so they're wearing uniforms. When men come back from World War II, they want to differentiate themselves. They want to have a role in the workplace, and they want women to not occupy that role. So women leave the workplace, they return to the house. You also have during this time period this huge expansion of conspicuous consumption, right? Middle class America is emerging, and that consumption is segmented along gender lines the same way that music was segmented around racial lines early on. So you go from looks like this to looks like Dior's new look in 1947, which popularizes the A-line dress. You also have the emergence of cosmetics as a standard thing women would wear, not just a little bit or on occasion. And you have the association of things like pink with being a girl and blue with being a boy. Dresses in general being associated with women. I mean, this kind of had already fallen out of favor, but I just include here for reference a picture of FDR from 1884. The gender in the post-war period is constructed largely along these methods of adornment, and it becomes much more strict, much more like bifurcated. And but it's all tied very heavily to conspicuous consumption. You have to have money to be buying a lot of cosmetics and a lot of consumer goods, and you have to have leisure time to not be wearing a uniform, right? And this is why I think country music artists are able to capitalize on the queerness element to make class arguments, right? I have to wear a uniform and it has to be spectacular because that's my job. I don't get the luxury of differentiating myself along gender lines because I can't participate in that kind of consumer culture. And I think that runs to this deeper idea, not just in terms of images, but also in terms of just the common currency of how things are understood, right? So I think there's a deeper connection between queerness and country music, or between queerness and imagery of the West. So you have figures I'm showing here, Harry Allen, who was a trans man, who is one of these icons of the Wild West, like a Wyatt Earp, a little generation after or two. He engaged in a lot of crime and was very popular in the tabloids as a result. And this is actually something that is fairly common for trans men in particular to go out into the West because no one knew who you were. There's no real society telling you what to do, and people capitalizing on this open spirit of the West, the same thing that drew country musicians to the cowboy image. There's also in precursors to country music, which will eventually involve a lot of blues. You have blues artists like Kokomo Arnold in 1935 releasing Sissy Man Blues, which is a gay blues song. And in country music, you know, even despite its like reputation as being fairly conservative, there's a history of queer country music with Patrick Haggerty's Lavender Country in 1973, or David Allan Coe's Nothing Sacred in 1978, which has a song called Fuck Anita Bryant, in which he rails against Anita Bryant and against homophobia. And the basis for his doing so in the song is that he was in prison. And he's like, my experience being in prison showed me that gay men are just like you or I. So there's this very easy to see this connection between polite society, the rich people, and the poverty of the working class and queerness. So that's what I think there's a kind of common currency here that allows you to make kind of class criticisms through queerness.
Yeah, right. And, you know, as I was reading your paper, one thing it reminded me of is, you know, shifting somewhat out of country music for a second is, you know, as Elvis became more famous, the introduction rather of the jumpsuit with, you know, the frill and the tassels and the rhinestones and all of like the jewelry, right? That was influenced directly by Liberace, right? In addition to him wearing, you know, eyeshadow mascara, I think, I guess from earlier on, but, you know, it was Elvis becoming Liberace, right? Who's, you know, I think, you know, presumably in the closet gay man, but it's pretty obvious to anyone back in that time period. This is a very flamboyantly gay man.
Yeah. And I do think that gets at kind of the deeper point, the Elvis example, because the Nudie Suit and Elvis's suit, kind of by proxy, Elvis's like very famous jumpsuits weren't designed by Nudie Cohn, but his Cadillac with the horns was designed by Nudie Cohn. And I think, let me see if I can pull up an example here, but Yeah. So in addition to there being like the Nudie Suit being like a song suit, right? People would make these suits to promote a single, and you had to use the proceeds from the single to buy the suit, which is $10,000. So you need to be able to have a good song to do it. And then eventually, I mean, imagine if your next single bombs and you're still wearing the same suit. It's a constant reminder of your failures. But it did have a kind of promotional function. But I think more important, if you want to talk about the functionality of a Nudie Suit, it's in terms of this country music authenticity stuff. And I claim in the paper that there's a kind of 3-act structure that's very common to country music. And this is people starts out act one. People are engaged in a heterosexual monogamous relationship. They're a kid in a rural environment that's pristine and idyllic. They're doing traditional labor, working on a farm or an honest living of some kind. They don't do drugs. They listen to mom and dad. Act two, they go and sow their wild oats. They, cheat. They commit crimes. They go to jail. They do drugs. They try to move to the city and make easy money, fast living. And then act three is I learned the error of my ways, right? I had my punk era and I've sowed my wild oats. I went on Rumspringa and now I want to go back, right? I want to go back to that idyllic life. And I think that's the re-endorsement of the values that make up country music's practical identity. And so what is the Nudie Suit? And what is the suit that Elvis is wearing? It's a poor person's idea of what a rich person would wear, right? When people criticize the Nudie Suit and say sharecroppers wouldn't wear this, that's true. But people who were born rich would also not wear that. It's I say, nouveau riche epistemic signifier, which is just to say, it tells the audience, I have situated knowledge. I went through Act 1 and I went through Act 2. I came from nothing. I was rural. I made money. I paid $10,000 for a suit. So when I sit on the stage and I tell you Act 3, you can believe me, right? It has a kind of authenticity to it. And you can see this in like the examples I have here. On the left, there's Fred Maddox's suit designed by Nathan Turk. Nathan Turk was talking to Fred Maddox and he realized your whole life story sounds like the Grapes of Wrath. And so he made this Grapes of Wrath suit to kind of capture that, reflect in his very expensive Act 2 suit, his Act 1, right? And you see that in Joshua Headley's suit in promotion of his album, Mr. Jukebox, where all the imagery on this is from the Everglades, and he's from Southern Florida. So it's a reference to his Act 1 on his Act 2, right? So this tells you, I tried that. I went into modernity and I tried to play the game and it didn't work out well for me, which is exactly what the audience is actually looking for. So when people say that country music is supposed to be music by and for rural audiences, working class audiences, country music, when it comes into its own outside of hillbilly music, is really marketed towards people who are now newly urban. So people, and most Americans were living rural lives up until the post-war period, and then they start moving to cities, and people want to reconnect with their roots. They've lived 1 and 2 of this act. And so they're pining for this lost, romanticized idea of the past. And so they're in the same position as the country artists here. But I do think there's a class element in that.
Yeah, right. And so this connection that you're pointing towards, right, toward, country music, low classness, white trashness, and queerness is just super fascinating. And, I think on, a more stereotypical conception, right? It's why would country fans be cool with men dressing in this effeminate way? And I think, you're drawing out precisely why, right? It's spectacle, basically, right? It's spectacle. I'm on a stage. What? I'm just gonna go out there and like in my blue jeans and t-shirt and just like sing a song. No. This is like what it is to be authentic country. Or at least one way of being authentically country
I am
musician.
beholden to the fashion criteria of my profession in the same way that you are. I put on this show for you. I show up for work the same way a mechanic shows up for work in a uniform. Um, and I endorse this idyllic previous life. But people really want that story in country music. I think of like George Jones' song Choices. People don't want a story about someone who never leaves their hometown. They want a story where, because it may just be that you couldn't afford to leave or you just never thought about it or something like that. People want to know that you consciously endorse the values, and that means leaving and choosing to come back, which is why you have people saying like, you want to get back to the basics of love, to go back to Lukenbach, Texas, and country songs. They're really about the newly urban, right? The newly middle class.
And it's interesting too that as you're saying that, it's just these are Hallmark Christmas movies, right? The girl who grew up in the small town, who moves to the big city, who then comes back for the holidays to the small town, falls in love with, the local maple syrup manufacturing guy who's,
The widower.
The widower running the
He's a
small maple
woodworker.
syrup business. Right, that there's that exact parallel is playing out in in Hallmark films.
Yeah, it's the traditionalist hero's journey, in a way.
Yeah, the hero comes back, and instead of like being radically transformed, it's, you know what? Things were better before.
Yeah, and it maybe is like a kind of, Frodo in the Shire moment where like, I'm glad that this exists for you, but it's too late for me. And that's what the tragedy of it is,
Exactly. He can't stay, whereas Sam is able to stay behind.
Yeah.
Merry and Pippin are, but Frodo, no. So I guess in this, like, Taylor Swift is Frodo Baggins, right? She's not going back to a rural living.
And it's a story as old as time. And that's tragic, right? They want to, but they can't do it. They've seen too much. They've done too much. Yeah.
Oh, I love that so much. I'm extraordinarily happy we got to this point. One question that comes to mind is about outlaw country, which in part is a rejection of, what Nashville country had become, including the association with the Nudie Suit, right? It's, we're going to dress in more rural rough wear, right?
Yeah,
The cowboy
down.
hat, the blue jeans, the vest, the leather vest, right? Really stripped down, thinking of Waylon Jennings, Willie Nelson, et cetera, right? And that becomes its own type of costume, its own type of uniform.
Yeah, and I think part of this is outlaw country music's real contribution to country music is that it very heavily normalized the introduction of rock elements like distorted electric guitars, drums. Early on, Ernest Tubbs, was one of the first people to play on the Grand Ole Opry with drums. You were not allowed to have a drummer on the Grand Ole Opry because that's not country music. So when you see this introduction of rock music styling into the music of country music, you also see this rock music style, like concept of authenticity come in, which is about someone who's coming on stage and giving you exactly what they are off stage, right? This kind of transparent persona that's normal in rock music. And I think that's what happens with a lot of these outlaw country musicians. They're supposed to look like they came just off the street wearing the same clothes that they would have, and they're playing rock style music, but it's really the rockification of country music.
Yeah, and it's a shift. There's a similar parallel in the shift from like hair metal to grunge, right?
Yeah, for sure. I hadn't thought about it, but yeah.
Good, we agree. And I mean, thinking about, contemporary, queerness and contemporary country, right? Like Orville Peck comes straight to mind.
Yeah, and we're actually living in the golden era of queer country music. I highly recommend, if the audience is interested, there's a online zine called Rainbow Rodeo, which just covers queer country music. I think there's a site called Queer Country that also looks at different artists. there's a ton of developments happening in queer country music right now. And I think in large part, probably, you know, because there's the sense of the openness of Western imagery, right? Of being an individual, going out and doing your own thing. There's also, kind of conceptual negotiation about Americana and American culture in general, who gets to access it, who gets the privileges of it. And this is happening for race and country music as well. Yeah. So there's a lot of very exciting stuff happening still. It has a long history though.
Yeah, awesome. So can we shift outside of country?
Yeah. So actually, when I submitted this paper for review, and Jack, one of the reviewers, one of their central complaints was, why should we think that costuming matters at all for the music? Which I thought was an interesting comment. And so I circled back, and I've now been working on this broader question, which I take it as kind of a backwards way of working on this. You would think you would just start with the high level stuff, and then country music is an application of that. But I have come to think that costuming matters in more ways than I realized with just the Nudie Suit stuff, right? So a very standard view of what a musical performance is sonicism, that it's a sonic artifact in a way. It's just the realization of a sequence of sound by live instruments or something. And sonicism has this kind of metaphysical version of sonicism that says that's what a performance is. And then there's also an aesthetic version, which says that's how it should be evaluated. And so if you think that's true, I mean, it's easy to see how you go from the metaphysics to the aesthetics to not talk about costuming because it's just a sonic artifact. I think that's wrong. A lot of people have already argued against this, and most of these arguments have had to do with personalism, or the idea that the persona matters. So over and above the sonic stuff, in the performance, you get access to the artist's persona, and that can matter aesthetically. Mostly, personalists have endorsed a kind of view that congruity matters. So you want someone's persona to be congruent with the performance. If you have, like, I don't know, Kids Bop doing, I don't know, gangster rap, right? Like, it's not authentic in the relevant sense, and people aren't going to buy it. And so the spectacle of the performance can matter for that because you access the artist's persona through the performance. I think fashion matters a lot in realizing this persona, and so it can matter for how we evaluate a performance, but it also just matters for other reasons, which I'm happy to get into.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in addition to fashion and costuming, right? It's staging, it's lighting, it's choreography.
Set design, yeah.
Right? Like the Eras tour doesn't make sense from the standpoint of sonicism, right? Or at least you can't make sense of what's happening from just that particular perspective.
And I do think that one very natural response would be to say, well, we can evaluate the musical performance and we can evaluate the costuming separately. And then if you want to like kind of hedge a little bit, you could say, oh, well, they're separate, but that would be exhaustive, right? If we understood the musical performance and we understood the costuming, and maybe there's a relationship between the two, then that's all there is. And so we don't need musical costume and aesthetics of musical costuming. We just need an aesthetics of music and aesthetics of costumes or fashion. And once we understand those two separately and we understand their interaction, that's all there is to it. I don't think that's right.
Yeah, and that's bullshit. So give us some reasons to think that that's bullshit.
Okay, my pleasure. So okay, the first of these is first I'm going to argue against the stronger claim that they're just separate things. The costuming, you could evaluate the costumes and then you could evaluate the music. And obviously personalism is a great way into that, right? So you mentioned outlaw country music, but if we have that kind of idea of authenticity, this rock notion of transparent persona, costumings are part of realizing that persona. Whether your persona is congruent or not with a song is going to matter aesthetically about whether it's authentic. And I'll give you a very one of my favorite examples. JoJo Siwa's rebrand. She wanted to start playing a new kind of music that she had recently invented called gay pop.
First
And
ever.
uh,
She's a
and
pioneer.
she knew that, like her image as a child singer was not going to lend credibility to that. It would be seen as inauthentic. So she had to rebrand. I Whether or not she succeeded, I'll leave as an exercise for the viewer. But the idea is that it matters as far as realizing the persona, and that matters as far as authenticity, and that's aesthetically relevant for the musical performance. In the same way, you might want to develop a bunch of different opaque personas, and that will matter for how we interpret the art. And I think David Bowie is a great example of that. So it seems like costuming can matter for the aesthetics of the song. I do also think, and maybe this is like a little bit more out there case, that costuming can matter for the ontology of the musical work. So my examples here are Beyonce, her Cowboy Carter era, and Guar. So with Beyonce, right, her Cowboy Carter image, people engaged in this huge debate about whether this is country music or not, real country music or not, authentic country music or not. What's interesting is Beyonce explicitly said it was not a country album, and collaborators who worked on the album with her also said the same thing. So why did people get into this debate? They got into it because they read it as country, but not sonically. They read it as country on the basis of images like this one, outfits like this. And so again, the aesthetics will matter, right? How we appreciate country music is different from how we appreciate pop music or R&B. And so it's aesthetically relevant, but it's also just ontologically relevant. Is this a work of country music or not? And the costuming seems to realize that in a way. Guar is another different example, and I'll now do a callback to your episode with Lee Cray on the metaphysics of bands, and say whether a song is a cover or not might depend on costuming. So the example that was used in that episode is Guar exists. They're all in costume. They have opaque performance personas, odorous Sarungus and all that. They're aliens, and they have the cover band Warg, which is made up of all and only the same members, and they cover only Guar songs. Now, whether those are cover songs or not seems to hinge a lot on the persona, and the persona is realized in large part by the costuming. So again, we have like another example where the ontology of the work, whether it's a cover or not, seems to depend on the costuming. Now, going the other direction, so that's the influence of costuming on music. We also have the influence of music on costuming. And I think if you want to understand, like for instance, here's a gown designed by Hanemori for Hibari Misora. She designed a lot of the work, a lot of the gowns, especially during the 80s for Hibari Misora. I think this is a really interesting parallel with the Nudie Suits because Hibari did a lot of cross-dressing in her performances early on, so there's a kind of queer element. She also, Hanemori designed uniforms, like for Japan Airways. So there's a similarity between the queerness, the uniform designs, and then I would say, go back and look at the original impetus for the rhinestones. So when they're on the burlesque dancers, they are supposed to draw the eye's attention towards particular areas of the body. And when they're on their nudie suit, they're supposed to outline the embroidered shapes to give people a sense of what's going on if they're far away, outlined in the stage lights. I think Hanemori's designs do a really good job of performing a similar role. They tend to have a lot of rhinestones, a lot of elements like that that catch the eye, framing the face. And Hibari is like a very expressive singer. You get more out of the performance if you watch her face. It helps you to understand, like you don't have to be able to speak Japanese to understand what's happening in the song by just watching her face and listening to the tone of her voice. The costume draws the eye towards the face. So in a lot of these gowns, they'll be black and the stage lighting will be very intense and this black backdrop. So her face just kind of stands out in this black void, and rhinestones draw the eye to around it, but not on it. And you see, like in the sash or other elements on other gowns, diagonal lines moving the eye towards the face, up the body. And so on this gown, the rhinestones don't continue down to the lower part of the gown. So they really just frame the face between the headpiece, the flower, the chest. I think if you want to appreciate the fashion here, you have to appreciate its role in amplifying the music, right? That's its like function. It's not just an article of clothing. It's an article of clothing designed to contribute to this overall musical performance. And then one more thing I'll say, going the other way, right? Going how music can help us understand fashion. It's not just the aesthetics of it or its function in this case, but also its meaning. So I don't think that when you look at a nudie suit, you would get that it serves this role as an epistemic signifier of like nouveau riche identity. You get that in part from its relationship with the music. In the same way, if you look at different punk fashions, they differ in ways that it's easier to understand if you understand the music. So I have here an example of like hardcore fashion, the band Minor Threat, and then crust punks, right? And one thing you always hear is people saying, oh, these punks, they're all about individuality and they all dress the same and all of that. And what I want to say is that only certain kinds of punks are about individuality. So in a lot of hardcore, there's an ethos of, straight edge. So that could be no alcohol, no drugs, no sex as conquest. Often that's tied with veganism or anti-consumerism. So as a result, the fashion that they engage with is working class. It's more uniform. It builds community because community is very important in hardcore, and especially in straight edge culture where people are trying to have their peers hold them accountable to those kind of ethical restrictions. I want you to make sure that I don't drink, right? It's about community building. And you see that in the music. It's very simple chord progressions, very simple songs that anyone can play, very democratized, gang vocals that anyone can yell. You don't have to be good at singing. Contrast that with something like metal, where it's constantly about like an artist's virtuosity at guitar or doing all kinds of pig squeals and other kinds of screaming. That's a very different attitude than the crust punks, who are more about individualism and freedom. And they wear leather in a way that the straight edge people wouldn't. So I think to understand the meaning and value of the fashion in this case, it really helps to understand the music. With that, I feel like then we did part of that work, right? Like we figured out how these two matter, they relate to each other. But I think we still haven't done the work of saying, what's this distinct domain of musical costuming that isn't just one relating to the other? And here I would point towards Chappell Roan's themed nights. So if you're not aware, Chappell Roan, the pop singer, during her tour promoting Midwest Princess, the rise and fall of Midwest Princess, she would go on Instagram before arriving in a city or before the tour started and announce that different dates in different cities would have different themed nights, and she would provide mood boards for all of those themes. So you can see here, mermaid theme was the theme for St. Petersburg, Madison, Norfolk. And you can see here a mood board for that. This is what she has in mind for being on theme. Midwest Princess, that's the theme, and you can see what that looks like. She has, I think it's like at least five or six different themes, maybe more. And these are themed off of her songs and off of her music videos. But what's happening here isn't the music and the fashion interacting. This is a separate thing, which is a communal aesthetic practice of people dressing together and listening together at the same time. Listening, dressing, I would hyphenate it. This is a unique social practice that you're not going to get from just having this observer mode of looking at the artist on stage, thinking about their costume and thinking about their music, or even how those two interact. that's something that it's communitarian, and it's a way of regaining kind of participatory engagement with music, which I think is something that's really exciting about musical fashion.
Yeah, awesome. And I think, related to that, there's, philosophy of music for such a long time was the philosophy of classical music, right? And then it shifts to, okay, we'll include some jazz too. And then when we get into the 90s, we have Ted Grasick, who's like, let's actually look at rock music. And then we sort of get, the philosophy of popular music more broadly construed, right? And there's an emphasis there on the recording, like the recorded track. And the recorded track is a purely auditory artifact, right? Or, I mean, obviously it could be physical or digital, but the track itself is encoded into this physical or digital product, right? And so it makes sense then, I think, with that understanding that if we're going to privilege the track as the focus of aesthetic attention within this tradition, that it's the sonic properties that matter, right? And so we
Right.
could strip it from everything else, and then performance gets demoted to this secondary thing, right? And so much of rock and popular music, including country music, is precisely the performance thing, right? It's precisely being there together with others, listening to a performance of the person, the artist on the stage or the band on the stage.
And I would argue that, there's so much of a remnant of Western classical music thinking in popular and philosophy of popular music that even jazz is seen as this one standout case that privileges performance more than anything. But there's still the idea that the recordings should be transparent. And that assumes this possibility that you can take what a performance is and transfer it to recording transparently without like preserving the meaning, preserving the aesthetic value. And so there's still this mode, which I think is deeper than, it comes from Western classical music. It's broader than music too. And I think it's like what Dewey describes in art as experience, where, or aesthetic experience, where he talks about the emergence of museums as this thing where countries and rich people could go and show off their stuff, right? And you have a particular mode of engagement that engenders, which is that there's an object of evaluation and then an observer. And this is the model that you get in modern recorded music, but it wasn't the model of most music for most of history, which was participatory. If you listen to music, you would probably be singing it at a church. You would be involved in making of it. When we get to recorded music, you see people engaging with it as this kind of sonic artifact, this preserved in amber, this recording, and they're just an audience member. They're just passive consumer of music. And this has only become more individualized as it goes on. Once we take people onto streaming, you can just divorce the recordings from any kind of social context, any kind of scene like punk or metal, any meaning like that, any local identity from the experience of like listening to a whole album. It's just totally individualized, totally atomized, and totally a consumer oriented arrangement. And that's what I think is really cool about musical fashion, is that it's a way to reintroduce participatory involvement in musical performance.
Yeah, and it's something, I think why concerts have come back so strong after, the pandemic and after the lockdown is precisely like people are, in a sense, wanting that communal type of experience, and why I think a lot of people, are starting to reject streaming services like Spotify and, sort of push back against that sort of thing. Is it is too atomized, it is too isolated, and getting back to listening to music together with others and being part of this communal participatory thing seems really important to people these days.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this also plays into the movement away on streaming, largely away from genres and from subcultures to aesthetics and to vibes. which I think people who are supportive of that, they tend to think, oh, well, when you look at these punks and the metalheads, I mean, they can be totally toxic. And that's very true. I mean, I came up in the straight edge world and people were literally carving each other up with broken glass if you drink alcohol. So it can be very toxic. The crew scene is like a gang world, basically. And people want to say that it's very shallow, right? Like you're doing all this because of people's musical tastes or their fashion tastes. Why don't you be friends with people for whatever reason, and regardless of aesthetics? But I think that's like backwards. And I think you can see that because of cases like the punk fashion, right? When you look at this, they're not friends because they dress the same or they listen to the same music. They're friends because they share the same values. And the aesthetic elements of that, the aesthetic practices associated with that, whether that's fashion or music, support that. They support a community based in values. And that's what I think people are missing when they think it's all superficial to have your friend group organized around aesthetics, is to say that aesthetics aren't what it's organized around. Aesthetics are this tools to help you organize around values. And it's hard to see how you do that in a streaming, atomized, totally individualized consumer market where people listen to like music to cook to playlists or like lo-fi chill music to study to, right? It's hard to see how you build a community of shared values using that because you just engage with it based on your mood, right? If you're like hype and you're working out, do that. And then as soon as you go home, switch to the cooking one. And then as soon as you're done with that, switch to the lo-fi going to sleep music. It's all just about what you as an individual are feeling, and everything is removed from a broader political and social context. Like it's hard to see how one particular song by Rites of Spring fits into a broader scene, a broader movement. If you're just listening to one song, you don't even know who the artist is. It just plays through on a long list of songs. And so I think costuming is a way to get back into that. You know, fashion is a way to build community into music again.
I love it. I think on that note, we will end this terrific discussion. So, Emmie, thank you so much for joining me. This was absolutely fantastic.
Thank you so much for having me.